Good evening, everyone. This is Shane Gebauer with BrushyMtnBeeFarm. I'd like to welcome you this evening to medications. Before we get into this, I want to just sort of lay the groundwork for this evening and say that what I'm hoping to cover here this evening is not necessarily here are the medications you should use. And I want to be very clear about this because what I may be using may not be an appropriate choice for you or the person sitting next to you or anyone else out there. That when it comes to medications, it's a spectrum of treatments. So you've got, on one end, you've got sort of the hard chemicals, and then on the other end, you've got integrated pest management, sort of a more natural approach, and you've got some options in between. And which options you select, of course, are highly dependent on where you place yourself on that spectrum. So for me, I can't make recommendations. That's not the intent of this evening's talk, but rather to lay out the options that are out there. Give some pros and cons about each one. Try and clear up what medications are used for which disease or pest, because these are questions that we often get this time of year. So that's the intent on tonight's talk, is going through these systematically, discussing each one, what it's used for, and some pros and cons. This also is not necessarily a talk meant to be the instructions for use. In other words, I'm not going to go through line by line exactly how to apply the individual medications that we'll be discussing. Rather, I'll provide an overview, but the label's the law. You should follow the instructions that come with the product, not necessarily the overview which I'll be giving here this evening. So with all that, you can consider that the disclaimer for this evening. With that said, let's get started. And I have to give credit to Kim Flodham for this picture, but I think it's appropriate. It sort of seems to reflect the questions that we get this time of year regarding medications, that no one really has a clear understanding of what they should be doing, how they should be applying it, or what it's being used for. And so that's the purpose of tonight, is to try and clear up some of that. So let's get started. Let's get into this now. This is the groundwork for this evening. Everyone have it memorized? Great. This chart, I don't expect you really to have comprehended all of this, nor will I by the end of this evening. But this chart's up on our website. You can see the URL down there at the bottom. It's in the resource section or the Be Educated section of our website. So you can refer back to it. It's a nice chart that goes through, you know, what the medication is and what it's used for, some general application, the treatment period, and some notes about it. So it's a good resource to refer back to. And again, that's in our Be Educated section of our website. You can find it up there. But I throw it up here, one, so that you can sort of understand the magnitude of what we're up against. There's a lot of information here, and it can be very confusing, but also provide this so that you know where to find it as a reference to go back to. So let's first talk about some of the things that are out there. Let's talk about Varroa Control. There's two general classifications of medications, and I would argue, although we're not going to talk about it here this evening, I would argue that there's actually three. And that gets back to that spectrum that I was referring to earlier, where you've got your hard chemicals at one end, and we'll discuss those in a second, things like Apistan, Checkmate, Apivar. And then on the other end of that spectrum, which is not necessarily listed right here, is the integrated pest management. And for me personally, I do think that there's some IPM techniques that do sort of take on the role of a treatment, although they're not really considered a treatment by traditional standards. Things like powdered sugar, things like drone trapping. And that's a different talk altogether. That's integrated pest management. What we're dealing with this evening are the actual medications. So we'll talk about some medications for Varroa Control, Nosema, as well as some others. And of course, the most important, I think, for people out there is the Varroa Control. So with that, let's get started. So starting with Apistan. This falls into the hard chemical category. The active ingredient is tau fluvalinate. The honey supers must be removed for this product to be applied. This is a product that's used for treating varroa mites, And generally it's one strip, and you can see in this picture over here, they're kind of difficult to see. They're these very light brown colored strips. There's one strip per every 5 frames of bees. So this person here is applying 2 because they've got more than 5 frames of bees here. The treatment periods for 42 days should be no longer than 56. I can't tell you how many times I've either seen or have been told by beekeepers that they just leave the strips in there. I once asked a customer how long they had been using Apistan, and they said, I don't know, let me count the strips. And they counted 10 strips, and so by that they deduced that they had been using Apistan for 5 years because they had been putting 2 in each year but never taking them out. It's very important to remove all these products from the hive. If you don't, that's one of the causes of resistance, because there's always this background level of miticide in the colony, and that selects for mites that can be resistant to that miticide. So, and also for that reason, it's not recommended for use more than twice a year. So it's a good idea to rotate through. Perhaps in spring use Apistan if you want to use the hard chemicals. Perhaps in spring use Apistan, and in fall use Apivar, or vice versa, so that you're not using the same thing over and over and over again, and therefore the potential for selecting resistant mites. Okay, so this is for Varroa Control. It's considered a hard chemical, and it's a 42-day treatment period. Let's talk about some pros and cons of this particular product. Fairly simple application. You put the strips in, you close your hive up, you walk away, you come back 42 days later. I should mention, though, that these strips, while not weather dependent, the hive does have to be able to sort of move around. It's a contact-based product. So in other words, the bees have to come in contact with those strips. So if it's 30 degrees outside and your bees are clustered and these strips happen to be on the outside of that cluster, the bees are not going to come in contact with it. Therefore, they will not be treated. I would also add that if it's that cold and they're clustering for extended periods of time, chances are it's too late in the season, too late into fall, early winter, for this product to really have a high degree of efficacy, and therefore have healthy bees going into winter. Because regardless of what product you use, you've got to have healthy bees going into winter. So now is the time that we need to start thinking about this. If you're up north, now is the time. If you're down south, you may have a little bit more time to work with. Some cons, I've already mentioned resistant mites. That in some cases, I've heard of people using this product. They put the strips in, they go back 42 days later, and there's still mites galore inside their hive. So what's going on? Well, if the mites are resistant to the active ingredient, to that fluvalinate, then they will not be killed. They will not drop from the hive, and therefore your treatment is ineffective. So what you must do whenever you're treating is look at the mite drops during that treatment, pre, during, and post mite drops, to gain an understanding of just how well this product is working. If you put these strips in and do a mite count on your bottom board, on your monitoring board, say a week or 2 later, and you don't see any mites, well, you know this product isn't working and you've got to try something different. So these resistant mites are scattered around the country, and so who knows whether you're in one of those pockets or not. Another con is that it does accumulate in the wax. That when you apply these strips, that fluvalinate does end up in the wax, and so the bees then are exposed to that. Now, fortunately, it gets into the wax. It doesn't dissolve very well in liquid, in water-soluble products, in other words, honey, and so it largely stays within the wax, but that is an issue. And more so as we gain an understanding of pesticides in our environment. The bees quite often are not directly affected by the fluvalinate that's accumulating in the wax, but rather the synergistic effect, the interaction of that fluvalinate with other products that are coming to the hive from agricultural use, other pesticides that are being used in agriculture brought back to the hive, and now you've got this interaction between these two products. And it's not just Apistan that we've got to be concerned with there. There's also the Checkmate that we'll be discussing in a second, and the Apivar as well. So some other things is it requires 2 trips to the hive, once to put the strips in and once to take them out, because you do need to take them out. And the price per hive here, this assumes 2 strips per hive, and it also assumes sort of the if you were buying sort of a single pack and not getting any sort of volume discount. So it's basically $5.19 to treat your hive once with Apistan. Let's move on to Checkmate. Checkmate, the active ingredient is coumaphos. It's an organophosphate. It was Section 18 for a long time, which basically means it was an emergency registration. It wasn't until just a few years ago that it got its full registration as Section 3. The one nice thing about Checkmate is that it's effective against Varroa and hive beetle. And this piece of Corex plastic up here with the Checkmate strip cut in half and stapled to the plastic piece here is how you administer this product for hive beetles, because you put this on your bottom board with the strips facing down, and the beetles scurry into these little grooves and come in contact with the Checkmate and are therefore killed by that. So you've got, again, 1 strip per 5 frames of bees. Again, it's not recommended for more than twice per year, or 4 times if you're using it for small hive beetle. If you're using this for Varroa control, you would apply it just the way the Apistan strips were applied. They sort of hang down in between the frames, and the bees come in contact with these strips and therefore exposed to the coumaphos. It's not recommended for cell builders. So this is for those people that are doing queen rearing, because we've discovered that the coumaphos has a severe impact on queen development, the size of the queen, the size of her ovaries, the acceptance of her, etc. And so, excuse me, it's important not to use this product in cell builders. If we move to the pros and cons of Checkmate, again, simple application. It's not weather dependent, except for, again, the bees have to be able to move around inside that colony. They need to come in contact with the strips. It's got a high degree of efficacy. Once again, we're seeing pockets of resistance. Mites are resistant to this product, so you do have to monitor to ensure that it's working properly. And again, it accumulates in the wax, sometimes at sublethal doses. But I'll mention that there was a study done by the University of Georgia where they tested the fluvalinate, they tested, the Apistan, they tested the Checkmate, they tested the next one, which is the Apivar that I'll be discussing. And what they found was that when these products were put on the outside edges of the hive, so they weren't necessarily using them for efficacy, but rather to test residue, they found that one application of Checkmate in the hive exceeded, they tested the wax after that application, and the concentrations of coumaphos, the active ingredient inside that wax, exceeded the EPA tolerances. So it definitely does accumulate in the wax, and that's a real issue, especially in light of all the pesticide work that's going on right now and the implications surrounding that. Some other things, again, it requires 2 trips to the hive. Price per hive, this again assumes 2 strips per hive, is $7.30, so a little bit more, a couple dollars more than the Apistan. The last medication in the hard chemical lineup is Apivar. This is a new product to the market in the United States. It was approved just this past spring for use in the United States. It's been used in Canada for a few years, and it's been used in Europe for several years. Its active ingredient is amitraz. Amitraz is a product, an active ingredient that has been used in the United States for a long time, even though it was not legal. It's under the name Tactic. People were buying Tactic and making up their own strips, shop towels, pieces of cardboard, etc., with Tactic, which contains the Amitraz. So it's something that's been around a long time, but now it's in an actual legal form. Because if you're using a product that is not specifically designed for use in a beehive, you're in violation of law, technically speaking. So it's nice to have a product that actually has Amitraz that is now legal. The honey supers must be removed. To use this product, it's again 1 strip per 5 frames of brood. The nice thing about this particular product is that there's a very short half-life to Amitraz. Amitraz breaks down extremely quickly inside the hive and in about 2 weeks out in the sunlight. Of course, there's no sun in the hive, but it still does break down fairly quickly inside the hive, more so than the fluvalinate or the Coumaphos, both of which are fairly stable products. It's a 6-week treatment, so it's 42 days. Again, nothing should exceed 56 days. You need to take them out. Some pros and cons. It's a simple product to apply, much like the Coumaphos and the Apistan and the Checkmate. It's not weather dependent, again, with that cluster being able to move about, the bees being able to move about. It's got a high degree of efficacy, short life to the active ingredient, to the Amitraz. The cons are, while the active ingredient Amitraz has a short life, the metabolites are more stable. In other words, the Amitraz breaks down into other smaller chemical molecules, and these are more stable inside the hive. And we're not really quite sure of the implications. I haven't come across some good studies that flag these metabolites as being detrimental inside the hive, so we're not quite sure. There's some more research that needs to occur there. And again, the accumulation in the wax. Now, Amitraz, again, it breaks down quickly, so we don't see Amitraz in the wax, but rather we see some of the metabolites in the wax, because the Amitraz breaks down so quickly. Again, 2 trips to the hive, once to put it in, once to take it out, and it's about $6 per hive. Now, I said earlier that I wasn't going to make any recommendations because someone listening in might say, I have no interest in using these hard chemicals. I'd rather be more towards the sort of natural side of the spectrum, and that's fine. I'll try and break it out in categories. For me, if I were in sort of the hard chemical group, it'd probably be the Apivar at this point that I would steer towards. That's me personally, if I were to use a hard chemical. Simply because it's a relatively new product to the United States, but not a new product to the industry. We're fairly confident in its impact to the hive, which is negligible, but it's got great efficacy. We don't see large pockets of resistance to this product, to the active ingredient that we see with the Apistan and the Checkmate, and so this product would be one that I would steer towards. That's not saying I am recommending this. I want to just be very clear about that. Okay, so that's Apivar. Now moving on. Let's move on to some of the soft chemicals. So now we're sort of moving more to the center of that spectrum toward a little bit more natural perspective. These soft chemicals, as a class of miticides, as a class of treatments, tend to require weather parameters. You need to meet certain weather parameters. They tend to work by evaporation rather by contact, and that's why weather plays such a role, which means that you have to be careful, because if you're outside the weather parameters, in other words, the temperatures are listed right there, if you're too high, you could overdose your colony, or if you're too low, it may not evaporate fast enough and you get an undertreatment. And as a class, this is a real detriment, a real issue with soft chemicals. But let's take the Mite Away Quick Strip. This is, I think, the third in the generations of Mite Away products. They're formic acid based, which is an organic acid. And the nice thing about formic acid is that it naturally occurs in honey. And when the company that that's producing these products, these Mite Away products, tested their formic levels, both pre-treatment, during treatment, and post-treatment, what they found was that there was formic acid in the hive before they treated. We know that. It's in the honey naturally. And of course, when they applied formic acid to the hive in the form of the treatment, there was a spike in the concentration of formic acid, as you would expect. However, after treatment, 2 weeks after treatment, what they found was that those formic levels had receded back to pre-treatment levels. So what we know then is that there's not the accumulation of formic acid in the hive, that it doesn't accumulate in the wax nor in the honey, which is a very good thing. So in this particular case, organic acid, formic acid's the active ingredient. You need to apply it between 50 and 92 degrees, that's Fahrenheit. And it's really the first 3 days that are most critical because that's when there's the most formic in the strips. And these are called strips, by the way, but they're really sort of these thick, jelly-like pads. They're not really pads. They're sort of like gels that are wrapped in a paper wick that wicks the formic acid out of the gel and releases it into the colony. So it's a different type of strip than what we've been discussing. So the strips are placed on the top bars like you see here, and you need to have a minimum of 6 frames of brood. That's because you need to have the bees. Typically, if you have 6 frames of brood, you have enough bees to support that brood to help circulate the air within that colony, to circulate the formic acid fumes through that colony and vent it out and distribute it evenly through the hive. This is the only product that is approved for use during a honey flow, which is very nice. So you can apply this with supers on. You can apply this just before supering or just after or during, which is nice. It's the only thing out there that's approved for that kind of use. The downside is that typically when you've got honey supers on, you may be outside of your temperature parameters, so it's sort of a trade-off there. And it's 100% compostable. In other words, you can take those things out, throw them in your compost pile, and they'll disintegrate with all your other organic matter. Many people actually just leave them in the hive, which you can do with this product, and the bees will eventually chew it up and remove it from the colony. Personally, I like to take them out just because it can take them a while to remove it themselves, and I just want to get that material out of the hive. Some pros and cons. Again, we talked about the fact that there's no contamination. The formic acid naturally occurs in honey, and it always drops back to background levels post-treatment. It works for both Varroa and tracheal mite, which is nice. There's no developed resistance, and we believe that there will not be based on its mode of action. It's got the shortest treatment period. It's a 7-day treatment period. It kills under the caps, which is one of the reasons it's able to have such a short treatment period, because those formic acid fumes are able to penetrate the caps that are sealing the brood and kill the mites inside the cell with the developing brood. Whereas all the other treatments that we've talked about thus far have been on work on contact, and thus the bees must come in contact with that strip. Well, of course, brood can't come in contact with it. It can only do that once it has emerged from the cell, which is why you need a longer treatment period for those types of treatments. Since this is killing under the caps, it can be 7 days, and it works just fine. I talked about weather sensitivity, that you need to have weather parameters that you need to meet in order to apply this. I'll also mention this, that the initial burst of formic acid can be pretty intense. And so what I've taken to doing, because this is a product that I've used, I will go down my row of hives and I will put the strips out on the covers of the hive and leave them there for 5 or so minutes. That lets that initial burst of formic dissipate, and then I'll go back through them and apply them to the hive. And that way that the hive doesn't get that initial burst, which can agitate them and cause excessive bearding. So that would be another con, is that initial burst of formic can sometimes be a bit overwhelming if you're at the upper end of the temperature thresholds. Also, something that is a serious drawback for many people is the need for personal protective equipment. The label states that you're supposed to wear nitrile gloves, which you should wear with all the products we've discussed thus far, but in addition to those, you should have a respirator on. Well, most people don't have a respirator that is suitable for organic acids, and so that's a serious drawback. It's interesting, I will mention this, that in Canada you do not need to have a respirator. That all they say is just stand upwind of the product and be careful not to inhale the fumes. So if you're in Canada, you don't need this. If you're in the United States, it's apparently a required piece of equipment. And I'll just say the label's the law. So that's what we have to say. This too, I say, requires 2 trips to the hive, once to put it on, once to take it off. But there are many beekeepers, and this is acceptable, that just leave it on the hive. So they put it on once and leave it and walk away and forget about it, and that way they don't have to go back a second time. That's fine, but it does take the bees a while to get those strips out of the hive. Price per hive, per treatment, is about $4.80. So it's fairly inexpensive. Next, another soft chemical, the Apalife Var. This is an essential oil-based product, so it's got things like thymol, eucalyptol, camphor oil, menthol, and some others, but it's all essential oils. You apply it by taking one of these wafers, and there's 2 in a pack, so you take just one of them and you break them into 4 pieces and you put them around the top bars of the hive, and you have to do this 3 times separated by 7 to 10 days. And again, it's temperature sensitive, so 65 to 95 degrees is the temperature range in which this product can be used. Some pros and cons. It's very safe. It's a mixture of essential oils. It's considered a natural treatment because it's essential oils. There's no developed resistance, and it's a shorter treatment period than the hard chemicals. It's about a 21-day treatment, so a little bit longer, quite a bit longer than the quick strips, but not as long as the 42 days that are required for the hard chemicals. Some cons, again, it's weather sensitive, so you've got to be careful of your temperatures. And also, there are some people that complain of a little bit of residual thymol odor that may persist in the equipment. That's not something that I have noticed, but it is something that people have mentioned, and so I present that to you. It requires 3 trips to the hive because you have to put those pieces on 3 separate times. You don't necessarily have to go back to remove the pieces that may remain. The bees will take care of those. And the price per treatment is about $5.48. So again, not terribly priced on a per hive basis. Let's talk about menthol, and I throw this one in there because it's used for tracheal mite, and it's not something that a lot of people are using nowadays. We still sell a fair amount of menthol, but not as much as we used to. I think tracheal mites have sort of fallen out of the consciousness of most beekeepers, and there's reason for that. Well, first is they're microscopic, so out of sight, out of mind. But beyond that, what we're seeing is that there's a lot of good resistant stock out there There are queens and colonies that are resistant to the tracheal mites, and so therefore this product isn't being used quite as much. But it is a soft chemical whose sole purpose is used for treating tracheal mite. Temperatures should be about 70 degrees or higher. It's a 28-day treatment. It has to be removed 14 days before adding a super, and it requires 2 trips to the hive, once to put them on, once to take them off, because they're in a little baggie that helps contain the material. And it's about $3.95 per hive. In terms of treatments, if I were to recommend one for the soft chemicals, honestly, it's a toss-up between the Quick Strip and Apple Life Var. I like them both. I think they're both very effective. That you can regulate a little bit on how much the bees are getting by how much you put on. Although the label is the law, you're supposed to put the 2 strips of Mite Away Quick Strip on and the 4 little pieces from the 1 wafer. But people have reported back that if they've got a weak colony, they don't want to necessarily put on 2 strips of the Quick Strip or the full wafer of the Apple Life Var, and so they'll bring it back a little bit. They may put 1 strip on, or only 2 pieces of that wafer of the Apple Life Var, so the colony, which is weak, may not be overdosed. Now, that's just what people are reporting back. That's not necessarily how the instructions report having to use the product, specify having to use the product, but it is something that can be done, that is being done by some people. Nosema, Fumagillin B. Technically speaking, Fumagillin B is the only medication approved for use with Nosema. And that's its only function. It's an antibiotic. You mix it in with syrup. It's about 1.5 teaspoons per gallon. And it's in the spring you want to feed about 1 gallon, and in the fall you want to feed about 2 gallons, so that they've got it stored up and they're consuming it all winter long. Works out to be about $3.33 for the spring treatment, $6.65 for the fall, because you've got to double it. Fumagillin B is an interesting one. You know, the researchers seem to sort of go back and forth a little bit. You know, some say it's not worth it. Some say absolutely use it prophylactically. I was in a conference once where one person stood up and said they suggested I not use it, which was great because it saved me just a ton of money and my bees did just fine. Others swear by it. Personally, I don't use Fumagillin B. Now, that's not saying I'm recommending going without it, but I don't use it. I do okay. Not last year. I did have some terrible loss last year, but in general, I do okay without using the Fumagillin B. But it is something that a lot of people swear by. And nosema is a serious, serious issue, and there's some new research out that looks at pesticides in the hive and how it plays a role in nosema incidence in the bees and the consequences of that. And so it may be that Fumagillin B becomes more of a necessity. We're not sure. I will also mention this, that while not an official medication, while not technically a treatment for nosema, that Honeybee Healthy has been shown to benefit the hive health. There has been research that showed colonies that were fed Honeybee Healthy had lower nosema counts than colonies that were not fed Honeybee Healthy. That's not to say that it's a treatment. And the reason why I'm sort of emphasizing that is because Honeybee Healthy is marketed as a feed stimulant, a food supplement or stimulant, so to speak, like a vitamin. And consequently, they cannot make any claims about reducing or treating nosema symptoms. Because if they did, they would have to go through the EPA for a registration. And so this is simply a product that you mix with your feed to stimulate feeding. and promote hive health. It's not necessarily a treatment, but there is some data to suggest that colonies have lower incidence of nosema if fed honeybee healthy. This is something that I do use almost as a matter of course mixed in with my syrups. I will mix in a little bit of honeybee healthy. It's essential oils. It goes a long way. 16 ounces makes about 24 gallons, which works out to be about $1.10 per hive. It may increase robbing. This is something that I've seen, is that it does contain lemongrass oil. Lemongrass oil is an attractant to bees. It's one of the things that makes honeybee healthy so effective. It's because that smell of lemongrass draws the bees to your feeder and induces them to feed, encourages them to feed, which is what you want. However, if you're in an area of severe dearth and colonies are prone to robbing, the odor of that lemongrass oil may draw in robbing bees. And so it is something you have to be cautious of. Personally, I think the pros outweigh the cons when it comes to the benefit of the product versus the risk of robbing. So it is something that I use. Myosin. This is for bacterial diseases. It's an antibiotic. It is used for AFB, American foul brood, or EFB, European foul brood. You sprinkle some on the top bars. You have to apply it 3 times every 4 to 5 days. And you've got to make sure your treatment is over 45 days prior to any sort of honey flow. So as you might imagine, this product's used a lot in the fall rather than the spring, because by the time you can get into your colony and do your treatment and then still have 45 days after your treatment before a honey flow, it doesn't work very well. So most people use this product in the fall. Works out to be about $1.56 per hive. This is something that the research, I think, is fairly clear on, that if you don't have an issue with American foul brood or European foul brood, don't use the product. Only if you start to see issues do you use it, and then the rule of thumb is that if you start, continue with your treatments prophylactically. But unless you see symptoms, there's really no reason to be concerned with Myosin. You can go without it. But once you do see symptoms, keep using it and use it prophylactically to make sure you don't have a problem. Inevitably, I'm sure this evening we're going to get some questions about small hive beetle. We've already talked about Checkmate and how it can be used for hive beetle control. Garde is another product that unfortunately is toxic to bees, so you do have to be careful. Now, this is not something that you're applying inside the hive. This is something that you're applying to the soil around the hive. Because what happens is the larvae, the small hive beetle larvae, migrate from the colony to the soil to pupate into adult beetles. And so they're killed once the larvae are killed once they're in the soil. So you want to apply this to the soil surrounding the hive. Now, I have this in here. However, if you've called and tried to get this product, you realize that it's on back order, unfortunately. The manufacturer of this product mixes up only a few batches a year, and this past spring when they mixed up their batch, apparently there was an issue with it. And consequently, they did not distribute, and they did not mix up a new batch. And so it hasn't been available since early spring, nor will it be available until much too late for this year. However, it is an option for hive beetle. I should mention, though, that this is a soil-drenched product. So in other words, the larvae leave the hive and enter the soil, and that's where they're killed, which means they've left your hive, which also means they've already done the damage inside the hive. And so that is still a problem when dealing with small hive beetles. So this helps prevent future generations, perhaps, but does nothing for the population of beetles that may be inside your hive. For that, I would suggest using beetle traps before using something like Checkmate. But in some cases, the infestation of beetles gets too much for those traps to be effective, and so something else needs to be used. But beetle traps tend to work quite well. Paradichlorobenzene, or paramoth. This is not your traditional mothballs. Traditional mothballs have naphthalene in them. Naphthalene is toxic to bees, and it gets into the wax. So paradichlorobenzene smells a lot like mothballs, but it's a little bit different chemical formulation. You should be aware of that. This is used for wax moth, and it's used on stored equipment only. There is no registered product for use for wax moth inside the hive. This is used only for stored equipment. So you can stack your supers 5 high, be sure they're sealed, and you place about 6 tablespoons on some paper on the top bars. And then as those crystals evaporate, you can replace as needed. And then once you're ready to use that equipment, you need to air it out a little bit. Okay? You need to let the paradichlorobenzene vent from the hive, because they will, if it's a heavy enough odor, they will abscond from the equipment. With that said, we're done with the medications. Again, I didn't get into the integrated pest management. That's a different talk altogether. There are some questions here, so let me pull up those questions. Let me get this going. There we go. All right. With the Mite Away quick strips, do you need to put the strips between the double brood chambers, or they can go on top? They can go on top of the box. They do not need to go in between. Okay. So here's someone saying, referring to formic acid being organic. Yes, it is an organic compound, but so is cyanide. Use caution. Formic burns skin and is a lung irritant. Yes, it is. You need to follow the label. But formic acid is a natural component within the honey already. I don't believe cyanide is in any sort of concentration within the honey. Formic acid is also something that birds use by picking up ants. Stinging ants, it's formic acid that causes that burning sensation. And so birds will actually pick these up and dust themselves with the ant to help with bird lice. Why can you not use Apple Var during a honey flow if it's essential oils and it says it's natural? Because those essential oils can make their way into the honey. And so you may end up with honey that tastes like thymol, or with a little bit of menthol and perhaps a little bit of camphor oil in there. And so while they are essential oils, they're not necessarily oils that are occurring in large quantities within that honey, and so you can create off flavorings of that honey, and certainly we don't want that. Let's see. Apple FR, what if the day temperatures are correct but the nighttime temperature drops to 55 or so? Will it still work? Yes. Let's see. Your treatment dollar numbers are per treatment, but if 3 treatments are required, your number needs to be multiplied by 3. Not clear in presentation. That's not true. Treatment is when I consider a treatment, it's not an application, it is a treatment, a complete treatment. And so in that case, the dollar amount that I gave was for a complete treatment. So if you need to apply something 3 times, it includes 3 applications of that. Let's see here. So this is a good point. I thought you only needed to treat for wax moths in stored brood frames. not honey frames. That I have to sort of tread lightly around this topic. Generally speaking, if you use a queen excluder and you don't get brood up in your honey supers, and you extract that honey and you let the bees clean it out so that they're dry, that's true. Wax by itself is not a sufficient diet for the wax moth larvae. They need the residues from the pupating bees, the cocoons from the bees, the pollen, the honey, and the other things that come along with brood frames as opposed to honey frames. And so that is true that if you have clean honey frames, generally wax moth will not be an issue. What is Apigarde? Apigarde is another thymol-based product. Apigarde, it's a gel that's impregnated with thymol, and it either comes in a tin, or you can buy it in bulk and apply it to like a little piece of cardboard and put it in there. You do need, you've got to do 2 applications, as I recall, which means 3 trips to the hive if you're using the tin. You go once to put in the first tin, you go the second time to remove the first tin and place the second one in there, and then you've got to go a 3rd time to get the empty tin out. Hopguard I didn't cover because it's not widely available, but it is a product out there. It is inexpensive. The feedback that I've heard from it is that it's effective if basically you just constantly are using it. And so a single application is inexpensive, but an ultimate treatment starts to add up. So I did not cover Hopguard, but that's used for both the Apigarde and the Hopguard are both Varroa treatments. Will Garde Star kill the nematodes used for small hive beetle pupa control? I'm not sure. I don't know, to be honest, but I'll try and look into that for you. Let's see. For treatment with hard chemicals. How to store honey supers when you remove for treatment with hard chemicals? Well, a lot of that can sort of be management practice. So typically people that are using the hard chemicals are doing so in early spring before they are adding supers, and so they're already stored from winter, or they are waiting until later in the season and removing their honey supers for extraction and getting their bees ready for winter and then applying the treatment. And so oftentimes it's just a matter of timing so that your supers are not an issue. They're either going to be going on after the treatment or they're coming off before the treatment anyway. And I think that's how most people deal with that. What is the syrup mix on fumagillin? I'm not quite sure of the question. It's a gallon. It depends on the time of year that you're feeding, whether it's a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1. But basically, you want to get a gallon into the bees. How do you know when to treat for Varroa? That's another talk altogether. But I would say this, that I think most people would say if you have an opportunity to treat for Varroa, you should take it. And I want to be careful here because, again, I like to think of treatment as a broader term. You know, powdered sugar can be a treatment. Drone trapping can be considered a form of treatment for Varroa. And it's not your traditional definition, but it is a means to control the Varroa population. And so the prevailing thought is that you should be, if you have an opportunity to treat for Varroa, you should take it. Because as our knowledge expands on Varroa and the viruses and how those viruses play a role in hive health and how high viral loads with other conditions can cause serious issues. We are now understanding that we need to keep our Varroa population low. With products that fumigate, like the Mite Away Quick Strip, how much and how long do you need to shut the hive and reduce ventilation? Actually, you don't shut the hive and reduce ventilation. In fact, some of the information out there on the internet regarding Mite Away Quick Strip application suggests perhaps even sort of offsetting the boxes from one another to create a bit of gap and increase ventilation. Honeybee Healthy has lemongrass in it. Does that not affect the honey? Well, the Honeybee Healthy is being mixed into the syrup, so you're feeding. And so if you're feeding, then there's not a honey super on in most cases, because you don't want to be feeding with a honey super on. Otherwise, they will just simply store your syrup. And thus, yes, it would have the lemongrass, the Honeybee Healthy, in it. But if you're feeding for spring buildup, that honey's going down into the brood chamber. If you're feeding for winter stores, that too is going down into the brood chamber, and so it doesn't really have much impact on the honey and the honey supers. Does powdered sugar even work? Well, that's a good question. There's a lot of people out there that say, no, absolutely not. There's a lot of people out there that say, yes, it absolutely does. I would say, my opinion is that it does work. However, how well it works depends a lot on how often it is applied to the colony. In other words, I can go to my colony right now and dust it with powdered sugar once a month. Am I going to control Varroa? No. May I knock some down? Yes. I might keep that population of Varroa from exploding, but I will not control it. If I go weekly, will I do a better job of controlling Varroa? Yes, I will. So a lot depends on how often you're using it. And a lot of people are using it a lot of different ways. There are many people that are doing it in both the manner that I just described. Some are using it as a means just simply to prevent the population from exploding until they can use some of the products that we discussed here this evening. Then you've got some people that are committed to using powdered sugar exclusively and don't want to use any sort of soft or hard chemical. And so there's lots of different ways to use it, and you will have different results from each method. Is the treatment the same for Mite Away Quick Strip if you're using 8 or 10 frame hives? Yes. Can the Mite Away Quick Strip be used with terramycin patty? Yes. So you mentioned placing the Mite Away Quick Strip on top of the hive for a few minutes before putting on the top bars. I recall reading something that mentions not to place it on metal. Is that correct? Thanks. That's a good point, that it will corrode metal. And so I should clarify that these strips, if you order a 10-pack, what you're actually getting are 10 individually packaged treatments. And so a treatment is 2 strips by most cases. And so you're getting a total of 20 strips. Each one of those treatments, 2 strips, are wrapped up in a cellophane wrapper. And so those strips will slide out of that cellophane wrapper. You can put that plastic wrapper on the cover, the strips on that plastic, so they're not in direct contact with the metal, because it will corrode metal. Yes, it will. That was also when Mite Away, gosh, I think it was just plain Mite Away when it first came out years ago. It's no longer available. They've sort of gone through these generations of product development. When Mite Away first came out, that was a big concern that people had. Is it going to eat away my screened bottom board? the hardware cloth, the galvanized metal that forms the hardware cloth in the base of my hive. That was a big issue, and people were reluctant to use it because of that. I can say that I've got bottom boards that I've been using since that product was out, and I've used formic acid products off and on over the years and still have the same hardware cloth. So it can be corrosive to metal, but not quite as much as people may think. Small hive beetles are a bigger problem than varroa mites. I know that hive beetles certainly is increasing in numbers and geographic distribution, but if you've got a strong colony, in most cases, and I know I'll probably get blasted for this, but in most cases a strong colony will sort of quarantine those beetles and prevent them from causing problems and prevent them from laying eggs, or if they do lay eggs, the bees clean them up so that they never hatch. So I'm still sticking with varroa mite as being the #1 issue confronting beekeepers, or I should say the secondary issue of varroa viruses, but they sort of go hand in hand. So in terms of most effective treatments for small hive beetle, the only thing out there that's legal is the Checkmate. There are people out there using illegal products, some of them which may be fine. Like I've heard people using diatomaceous earth, which is just diatoms that grow in the ocean. It's basically like little shards of glass, essentially, that slice through the exoskeleton of the beetles, and so they dehydrate. That would be considered an illegal use of that substance, but it's fairly effective and fairly safe if used properly. There's other things like products that are used for roach control that are being used inside a beehive that I question their safety. But the only legal treatment for in the hive use is the Checkmate or the beetle traps. Is freezing as effective for wax moth problems as paramoth or mothballs? Freezing frames, if you freeze them for 24 hours, 48 to be safe, is an effective method for dealing with wax moth. No form of the wax moth, either egg, larva, or adult, can survive below 32 degrees for extended periods of time. And that's why wax moth tends to be more of an issue in the fall, because most places, even here where I am in North Carolina, you get temperatures that dip below 32 degrees. So they seek refuge in maybe garages or in storage sheds or things like that may be cushioned, buffered a little bit from cold temperatures. But even up north, a shed will dip below 32 degrees, an unheated shed, and so the wax moth really suffers tremendously in those areas, and it takes a while for their population to rebound after coming through winter. And so we don't see much problems of wax moth until later on in the year once their population is a little bit higher. So freezing is very effective in dealing with wax moth. That's one of the reasons why I store my equipment outdoors in an unheated space to help control the wax moth. If you have a freezer that you can store equipment in, great. Most of us don't have a freezer either large enough or one we can dedicate to our bee supply equipment. So consequently, that's not an effective option, but maybe you can rotate your equipment through, freeze it for 24 hours, and then store it in a plastic garbage bag and seal it up so wax moth can't get in. I will caution here that you have to be very, very careful that moisture does not accumulate inside that sealed plastic bag and cause issues with fungus growing on the frames or mold. So you've got to be careful there. Let's see. Let's see here. We'll take one last one. How do you dispose? Well, maybe let's take a couple. How do you dispose of the mite away? it's the new stuff is compostable. You can literally throw it in your compost bin. It's got what makes up that gel? It's like a sugary starch or starch based product that forms the gel, and then you've got your formic acid, and then you've got a paper wick around it, sort of like a coffee filter type material. Is there anything else that can be used to prevent spreading American foul brood to other hives if you suspect just one of your hives is infected? What I would suggest in that case is if you think you've got an issue of foul brood, get that hive away from your others. Make sure that you're not exchanging equipment between that hive and your others. And also make sure you sterilize your hive tool, that you sanitize the smoker bellows, because you're going to be handling frames and then puffing the smoker bellow, and so you could transfer foul brood spores from the wax of your tainted hive to the bellows, and then from the bellows to your clean hives. Bee inspectors actually are required in most cases to work without gloves for this reason, because it's very difficult to sanitize your gloves. Now, you can use disposable gloves like the blue nitrile or latex gloves where you can just dispose of them, but you want to make sure you're not using the same, if you do use gloves, that you're not using the same pair of leather gloves when you're working your foul brood hive and your others. And the other thing that I'll mention is that a lot of times, I hate to say this, it's just much easier just to destroy the hive. I really hate to say that, but if you've got foul brood, those spores, those American foul brood spores, are very, very stable and last for years and years and years. And that's why they came up with that prescription of burning the hive to dispose of foul brood issues. So you can do it. You can keep a hive that has foul brood. You can medicate it and you can keep it alive, but it's a real challenge. And the other thing is that depending on what state you're in, the bee inspectors may take issue with that, because it's on the law books that in most states, if your hive is found with foul brood, the prescription is to burn it. Now, a lot of states may still have that on the books, but the inspectors are not enforcing it. Some inspectors still are enforcing it, so you've got to be cautious about that as well. All right, this will be the last one. I understand freezing for 48 hours is also effective on hive beetle. Is that correct? Yes, it is, but it's got to be 48 hours. It takes a little bit longer than the wax moth. And I'll also mention that the biggest issue that I hear about from hive beetle, while we're on the topic of hive beetle, the biggest issue is in colonies that are failing otherwise. Either they've got a poor queen, they're hive diseased, they're in shade. Colonies in shade tend to have more issues with hive beetles than colonies that are in sun. So they're failing. They've got some trouble already that allows that hive beetle to take over and thrive. And the other time that I hear of hive beetle issues are when the beekeeper harvests the honey. Maybe they'll harvest today and say, well, I can't get to it today. I'll get to it next weekend, and it's more than 3 to 4 days away. And so what happens is you harvest those supers, the bees are removed, but beetles may remain. You may not see them. You bring those supers back to your honey house. There's nothing there to keep those beetles in check, so they run amok. They make a mess of those supers, and you don't find it until a week later when you go to extract the honey that you've harvested. So you've got to make sure that when you harvest your honey, you extract it within 3 days of pulling it off your hives, just to be safe, and you don't end up with a mess. All right? So with that, we're a little bit beyond 7 o'clock. I apologize to those of you whose questions I did not get to. Feel free to give us a call, shoot us an email, and we'll do our best to get to them. Hopefully that cleared up some of the confusion surrounding medications. There's no doubt it's a daunting task. There's a lot of things out there to consider. There's a lot of different approaches to beekeeping. but hopefully I covered it in such a way that regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, you gain some insight into the world of beekeeping medications. Until next time, have a wonderful time beekeeping. Good luck. Hopefully you're getting lots of honey this time of year, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.